Welcome back to Online Confirmation. We're going to continue today our conversation about the Bible as we move to what Christians call the New Testament. I told you in the past that we share the Old Testament with our Jewish brothers and sisters, and so sometimes I will even call it like the Hebrew Bible. Jesus himself was Jewish. Jesus' family would have been Jewish. All of the early disciples, all of them were Jewish. In fact, Christianity in many ways grows out of Judaism. In our last conversation together, we talked about the writings of the prophets, so the books of the prophets, which might be a little less confusing, right? Because we know that if we split the Old Testament into three major categories, it would be law and writings and prophets. And we remember that God made promises to God's people in the law and in the writings that God had established the promise that God made to God's people. But also, we learned the ways in which maybe the people themselves didn't always hold themselves to their end of the covenant with God, to be God's righteous people in the world. And that there came a time in which God kind of separates God's self from God's people, as a way of reminding them that what God expects from them is humility and justice. It's a very difficult time for the Jewish people, a time that we call the exile, where the temple is destroyed and God's people are spread throughout the known world at that time. And in that experience, people began to ask, will God keep God's promises to us? It's the prophetic writings that we hear this promise that God makes. I will send one to you to reestablish the promise that I've made to you. That I'm going to make you a great people and a blessing to the entire world. That through you I will bless the world. And there is a promise made that God will send a Messiah, an anointed one. Christians believe that Jesus is that Messiah. So the New Testament is the ways in which Christians, right, these kind of Jewish folks who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, understand the way that God works in the world through the person of Jesus. So it's good for us to know that that's how the Bible kind of flows. The story flows into the New Testament, where Jesus becomes, as far as Christians are concerned, this one that God promises to send, this Messiah, this anointed one. But Christians go one step further. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is more than just the Messiah, right? Just somebody who was sent to be a leader to the Jewish people. But one step further, that Jesus is God's decision to become part of our world. That Jesus is God. That Jesus is God joining us in our lives, in our struggles, in sin, and death and evil, and that Jesus will do more than just simply establish a kingdom. That Jesus will establish a holy kingdom of the Spirit in many ways, not just of a land. Is God's will on earth that comes to us. So for Christians, the Messiah is more than a person or a king or a leader. The Messiah is ultimately God. And that's what we say about Jesus. I like to say it like this. Jesus is God's decision to come and live among us. And that's what we think of as Christians when we think of the Messiah. So the New Testament tells that story. What I want to concentrate on today are the first 4 books of the New Testament. And if we put those 4 books together and we get a name for them, right? Just like the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we call those things the law. The first 4 books of the New Testament we call the Gospels. This can get confusing because Christians, when we say the word gospel, we can mean 2 things by that. And those things are related. The gospel is the message of God's love for us in Jesus Christ. That's the gospel, or the good news, that God comes into our world in Jesus Christ to set us free from the power of sin and evil and even death. But gospel also is used to describe the 4 books of the Bible that tell the story of Jesus and his ministry on earth. Right? The gospel comes to us as a promise, and the gospel describes a literary sort of genre, what a fancy word there, but a type of writing that tells us the story of Jesus and how Jesus brings that good news to us. So we'll use those terms and they'll mean a lot of different things. But today, let's just think about the gospel in terms of these 4 books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, do you see what I did there? I mean, it's 4 books, of course, but in some ways, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a way of telling the story of Jesus that is unique from the way that the Gospel of John tells this story. Scholars will say that those first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they derive from the same source, and they kind of generally tell the story of Jesus in the same way. And then there's the Gospel of John that tells the story of Jesus in its own unique way. Listen, it's enough for your confirmation class that you know that those first 4 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are where you're going to hear the stories of Jesus' ministry, of His life, of His miracles, of His death, and of His resurrection. And they're going to tell the stories in unique and different ways. So, for instance, the Gospel of Matthew is going to start with the story of how Jesus is connected to all the stories that we've been talking about in the Hebrew Bible. There'll be a genealogy in which Jesus is going to be connected to the great kings and to Abraham and all of these wonderful folks that we met in the Hebrew Bible. And then it will tell us the story of the birth of Jesus. It's fantastic. Then we're going to move to the story of Mark, and we might expect that same story, but it's going to be told a little bit differently. In the Gospel of Mark, we meet Jesus when He's about 30 years old, beginning His earthly ministry. It's fantastic, right? It just tells the story a little bit differently, from a different perspective. There were different communities in the early church, and they had their own way of telling the story of Jesus, and it was wonderful and beautiful, but yes, a little unique. Then we move to the Gospel of Luke. And the Gospel of Luke is going to tell the story of the birth of Jesus and start from the time that He is a baby. And it's even going to tell us the one story that we have from Jesus when He's a teenager, when He's left behind at the temple. What a great story that is. And then the Gospel of John, again, will begin in a unique way. And will tell the story of Jesus' ministry from the time that He's an adult. So they'll all tell the story of Jesus, but in their own unique way. The one thing that every gospel tells us, however, is the story of what we call the passion of Jesus. It's a story of His crucifixion, of His suffering, because that's what passion means, right? Suffering. Every one of these gospel stories will tell us of the suffering of Jesus on the cross and then the glory of His resurrection. For Martin Luther and for Lutherans, and for all Christians, right? But for Martin Luther, this is ultimately the story that must be told. All of those other stories are told in such unique ways in the Gospels, but every Gospel tells the story of how God enters into our suffering, because that's what happens. As Jesus suffers, as He is abandoned, we realize that, well, so are we at times. And that God has joined us in those places where we suffer the most, right? When we hear about the ways that Jesus is falsely accused, we are reminded that those things happen to us in our own lives. And we're reminded that God meets us in those places, that God joins us in our own suffering. And even in the death of Jesus, we are reminded that there's no place that we have to go in our lives that God won't go with us. So the suffering of Jesus on the cross, this is told in all the Gospels. And the resurrection of Jesus, the way that God defeats the power of all of those things in our life, sin and death and evil, that in the resurrection, God triumphs. The Gospel stories tell us the story of the life of Jesus, right? All of them in their own unique way, and it's fantastic and it's wonderful. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every one of these texts tells us the story of the suffering of Jesus. And we are invited to remember that when we suffer, God knows what that experience is and that God joins us. And we are also reminded, though, that our suffering and our death, those things never get the last word. Because just like as Jesus suffered and died, but then conquered those forces Those accusations that were made against him, right? The ways in which everybody ran and fled and left him to be by himself. The ways that he was falsely accused and harmed, because we all go through those experiences. In his resurrection, we see that God always gets the last word. It's not sin and death and evil that finally speak the last word about us. It's God. So in ways, we are joined into the story of the four Gospels. We are invited to see in Jesus God's decision to become part of our own story. It's a beautiful story. It is the gospel story told in the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that's not all that we're going to find in the New Testament. There's more. Of course there's more. And we'll talk about that in our next sessions. It's enough that we know what the gospel texts are and the promise that the gospel texts make to us. Death has lost its sting. Eternal life is our inheritance with God. That's the story of the crucifixion, and that's the story of the resurrection of Jesus, and that's the story of your life as well. Death and pain and suffering and the evil of our lives that we have to oftentimes endure, and that sometimes maybe we even cause, that those things will never have the last word about you. God will. That word is resurrection, and that word is new life. And we find that word in the church. And when we start studying the next texts of the Bible, we're going to learn about the church, about this wonderful thing that God gives us, so that we can always grasp hold of the promise that God has made to us. That the church is the way that God shares that promise with the entire world. All right, enough of that. We're going to get to that in our next session. I hope you have a fantastic day. You absolutely deserve it. And we'll see you soon. Peace.